I just wonder what your thoughts are. I mean, clearly Labour way ahead in the polls, 20 points ahead in the polls. I'm starting to see some shift tonally in what Labour's saying, i.e. Labour hasn't really said very much and they've kept that poll difference. But now you've got David Lammy actually saying the EU will be Labour's #1 priority in foreign policy once in government. He said there would be, to use his words, a tonal shift in UK-EU relations. He says our future prosperity is bound up with the EU. He said that actually we should have structured meetings every 4 and 6 months to discuss the issues that matter to both parties. Is that wise, given that those voters in the Red Wall, which I know only too well because they're the people who voted me in as an MEP, is this wise when they're Brexiteers who are now thinking about voting Labour? Is he right?
I think if I was advising them, I think I can see the logic there. I mean, there's a number of things you have to factor in. Firstly, his comments come against a background where Labour internally is currently, and Keir Starmer is currently under a bit of internal pressure because of his foreign policy stances, particularly, obviously, as we've seen in relation to Gaza. So I think there's a little bit of element of recalibration, if you like, of David Lammy saying some of the things in foreign affairs that Labour members, Labour activists and traditional Labour supporters actually want to hear. So that's part of the strategy. The other thing is part of a broader strategy which we've seen, which is Keir Starmer and Labour are now coming out to play, if you like, on the international stage. We've just seen Keir Starmer at COP. We've seen Keir Starmer himself recently did a sort of a tour of Europe and Brussels. And speaking to Labour officials, I think they do feel they now have the opportunity to, as you like, in international affairs, start to get their tanks on Rishi Sunak's lawn to an extent, and start to demonstrate Keir Starmer's international statesman credentials, if you like. And there's a reason for that, and I think you've touched on it a little bit, which is whatever we think about where Labour is on Europe, the Tories and Rishi Sunak are all over the place on Europe. I mean, and we've seen it again this week. We currently have the spectacle in relation to immigration, in relation to Rwanda, of Rishi Sunak again coming out saying, we are not going to let foreign courts dictate what we do on immigration. But the problem for him is that the British people were told that had already been dealt with. They had been told they'd voted for Brexit. They were told we had got Brexit done. They were told that the days when foreign courts could dictate what our domestic policies were over. And once again, they now see Rishi Sunak coming back and saying, oh, well, we weren't quite right about that, but don't worry, we'll fix it again. So I think Labour feel there is an opportunity to exploit Tory divisions in this area. And to be honest, I think they're probably right. I think they probably can.
I think many voters see unfettered immigration into this country, 746,000 net migrants coming into this country last year without the schools, without the hospitals, without the infrastructure. A couple of the panellists earlier made a really interesting point, which is, are people now beginning to change their view about the European Union? Because, and I made this point earlier, that culturally we are much closer to our European friends and allies than we are to many people who are now coming to this country. Do you sense a shift that Labour can exploit?
I mean, there may be an element of that. I mean, but as I said, I think the broader point is that it comes back to what is the fundamental strategic problem for Rishi Sunak, in that he was inserted as Prime Minister as the guy who would deliver, if you like, on a Tory policy agenda. He wasn't Flash, he wasn't Boris, he wasn't a great sort of national leader. He was a bit of a technocrat, but you put him in and he'll dot the I's, he'll cross the T's, he'll look at the spreadsheets, he'll get things done. You've just touched on it. And again, I was speaking to Tory MPs about it this week. who frankly said to me they were aghast at the legal migration figures that have recently been introduced. So because they said you've got the situation now where legal migration, in their view, is out of control, and they think in the view of the British people is out of control. Illegal migration is perceived to be out of control with the small boats crisis. But as I said, all of this is being done in a context where we have left the EU. We have supposedly taken back control. And I think Labour's thinking on this issue is, and they obviously have to be careful about it, they don't want to seem to be too sort of pro-EU zealots for the reasons you articulated. But they think there is quite clearly a way they can now, by talking about these issues, they can highlight the fact that in relation to the whole Brexit debate, and in relation to this idea that under the Conservatives, the British people have been allowed to take back control, that quite clearly they haven't been able to take back control.
And I think that's a very real sense around the country. Just in terms of the Rwanda fly, I mean, we were promised emergency extraordinary legislation from the government. That hasn't materialised. Rishi Sunak is under enormous pressure now to do something, whether it's to ignore the ECHR. You've got Robert Jenrick also saying they need to increase the minimum salary from $27,000 up to $45,000. Also, these mooting the fact that if you are here for health and social care reasons or to work in that sector, you can't bring dependents, and scrapping that shortage occupation list. If the Tories get control of immigration, as they keep promising, can they turn this around?
I personally don't see how they do, for a number of reasons, and you've just touched on it yourself. The scale of the figures just in terms of legal migration was so great and so high. What you just described there, and it's no doubt Tory MPs want moves of that nature, but that is basically just going to be tinkering around the edges in terms of the sheer numbers, and for it to have any political impact, that sort of huge increase in legal migration would have to be absolutely slashed at the time of the next election. The second thing is the Rwanda scheme would have to be up and running. Flights would have to be taking place. Hundreds of illegal migrant / asylum seekers would have to be removed from the country. And that would then also have to be seen to be having a direct impact on small boat arrivals. How all that is done, given the time frame the Tories have left before the next election, and most people are now talking about probably an election sometime during the summer, but at the latest in October. The idea that these transformations can take place in a period of 5 or 6 or 7 months, when they haven't been able to do them over the last 13 years, or certainly over the last 2 or 3 years since we left the EU, I just don't see it. And I think, crucially, an increasing number of Tory MPs can't see it either.
Can I just finally ask you about Wes Streeting? Because I think everyone in this country knows the NHS is under enormous pressure. Many people feel they're just not getting the service they pay for. 7 million people waiting on the waiting list that we know of, and then there's the secondary waiting list as well. Wes Streeting now in Australia, he says what we need is GP hubs. You can walk in the evenings and weekends. He said that Labour would shake it up. He's looking at that Australian system, which, as we know, is where you have insurance, or it's an insurance-backed system. They don't have the waiting list that we do. Is this very brave, or is it very foolhardy for a secretary, or for someone who may well be Secretary of State, to be mooting now in the electoral cycle?
I think he's brave. I mean, and I think, you know, one of the criticisms I and other commentators have had of Keir Starmer and Labour is they're not really saying what they're going to do. They're not really saying anything particularly new. They're not really saying anything particularly radical. They're just sitting in and waiting for the Tories to lose the election. And I think Wes Streeting is the exception to that. I mean, obviously, we had the comments from him a couple of weeks ago in which he said he was going to look to get as much private investment as possible and private sector support as possible into the NHS, which got him a lot of criticism, obviously, within his own party. You know, he's shaking things up a little bit again with those most recent comments. But I think of all the Labour frontbench spokesmen, he's probably been the boldest in terms of trying to set out his stall. And to be honest, I think he deserves a bit of credit for that, actually.
And finally, if I may just ask you, is it a slam dunk for Labour?
Yeah.
Interesting. Thank you very much indeed. Really good to talk to you, Dan. That's Dan Hodges there, former Labour advisor and columnist at the Mail on Sunday. That was a pithy answer.